Jesus' first and last words to his followers are surprisingly the same. Follow me. Life, he is letting us know, is about movement. It is about stepping forward. In fact, we can't stop ourselves from it. We take big leaps or inch forward in everything from finances to a budding romance. But what direction we take will determine where we end up. And if we journey with Jesus, our lives will pulse with true life, over the brim life. Even as we descend into valleys, walk through long plateaus, and climb up to peaks. In Pathway, we're learning about the crucial steps in a life of faith. What to expect ahead and what it means to follow Jesus exactly where you're at this very moment.
So I attended a conference a number of years ago that was put on by Christian artists, creatives, people who were singer-songwriters or visual artists like painters or sculptors, or they were novelists there. And there were a lot of these people I really admired. I followed them on this blog. If you remember blogs, they were, you could go and read and yeah. But I went to this conference and I got connected to a person there who was helping put it on. And so then at the end of the conference, I was invited to the after party. So I went to the house of this musician, someone I really admired and liked. Went to this person's house and there was this bonfire, and I sat around this bonfire with all these people who put on this conference, and they were, artists and creatives, people who I liked from that blog and from that conference. And it was one of those moments that kind of makes you go, how did I get here? So then, fast forward then to the next year, and I attended the same conference, but this time I noticed some difference in myself, and it was that in my interactions with other people, I'd feel like either a sense of relief and accomplishment if the conversation was going well, or dread if the conversation I felt like it was not going so well. And it was as if there was a radar that had been turned on in my mind that was just constantly scanning and constantly evaluating, how does this person, this interaction, or this moment help me with my status here in this group? And if I'm honest, I was also kind of wondering, am I going to get invited to that after party again? And it was kind of terrible, and in some ways it didn't ruin the conference, but it definitely added something that wasn't as fun. There was this low-grade worry, there was this low-grade anxiety, and it was annoying me to the point where I wished I hadn't been invited to that after party the previous year. And then as it turns out, I wasn't invited back, so it worked out great. So what I'm describing is a desire for status. It's this kind of posturing, and it's very normal human behavior. Psychological research indicates that humans are widely driven by this desire for esteem, respect, affirmation, and it's all based on social rank. Psychologists actually say it's a need that's in us. And while it's debated how deep this need goes, it's hard to deny that the way other people perceive us, it influences us. It changes how we think and how we feel, how we act and behave. So today we're going to be in the book of John, chapter 3. You can go there in your Bible, and we're going to read about John the Baptist there. It's going to be in your Bible, or it's going to be on the screen behind me. So what you have to understand about John the Baptist was he was a bit of a rock star. He was this miracle baby who arrives on the scene, and he has all this intrigue around him because he lived in the wilderness and he was experimenting with diet trends, and he dressed in unconventional ways with a shaggy hair and beard. And then we see him doing rock star stuff. He's challenging religious elites, and he gives these incredible speeches out in the wilderness, and in Mark it says the city and the countryside flocks to him. So that means your county folk and your urban elite, they're all of them, everybody from across the board, they're getting drawn in to John's allure. He had this kind of magnetism. You can look at him and you see his star is rising. He's up and to the right. He is the moment. And yet, as we read here, we see something different in John. So we're going to pick it up, chapter 3, verse 22. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salim because water was plentiful there, which is a great reason. And people were coming and being baptized. We're going to jump ahead to 26. John's disciples came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, He who is with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to him." John answered, "A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I have said, 'I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him.' The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, I must decrease." So like Brian said, today we are looking at humility. We're in this teaching series called Pathway. We've been looking at words like interested, as we're interested in following Jesus, and then how we're engaging with our faith in following Jesus. And then last week we talked about angst, how in following Jesus, this is something we experience along the pathway. And then out of angst, we are led into humility. Now, humility is a bit of a funny word because if somebody calls you humble, you go, I think they mean that as a compliment. We're not sure because our world doesn't actually really value humility. It's kind of like if somebody calls you meek, you're like, thanks. It's this kind of backwards value, but it's a beautiful word. You can see the beauty of it in C.S. Lewis's definition. He says, true humility, it's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Right? You see the difference? Where, it's not like this depreciation of yourself. It's just knowing who you are and what you are, and then thinking less of yourself from that place. A good example is E.M. Forster. He was an early 20th century novelist, and a biographer of him wrote of him that to speak with Forster was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity that you had to be your most honest, sharpest, and best self. This inverse charisma. It sounds like a great description of what humility feels like when you're receiving it from someone else. Have you known someone who's they have that inverse charisma? They don't feel the need to speak a lot. You don't hear them inserting themselves into the conversation that they're right. They seem genuinely interested in you, and they champion other people's successes. They're the person, they're resisting the temptation just to talk about themselves all the time and their achievements. They have an inverse charisma. And this is John. He has every reason to believe that he deserves something. All the evidence of his life is pointing to it. He's on this upward path. He is ascending. And yet he says, I must decrease. So how do we get to that? How do we get that kind of humility? How do we go on that downward path? How do we descend? And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at this way of humility by three primary paths. We're going to look at our discipleship to Jesus. We're going to look at the deeper life, and then we're going to look at difficulty, and we're going to kick it off with discipleship to Jesus, and we're going to talk about a different passage in Luke 14. We don't have to turn there, but I'm going to talk about it because Jesus, he gives some interesting party advice in Luke 14. He says, if you go to a party, don't take the best seat that's there. Don't go sit close to the host, because if someone arrives who's a bit more important than you, then you're going to have to be moved, and it's only going to be the lowest seat that's left. And so in an ironic way, you sat in the highest seat, but you have to sit in the lowest seat. And then Jesus says, but when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. And then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. So it's helpful to know a little bit of what's happening in that culture, in this ancient Greco-Roman world, because a meal like the one Jesus is describing, it's actually meant to highlight social disparities between different people. It was actually really obvious who was in what social rank. It was openly discussed, it was openly talked about, and there was ways to compete. You were expected to try to climb. We're much more covert about it. I think we do similar things, but more covert about it. For them, it's important though, because it determines every other aspect of your life. It determines your work, it determines your income, it determines who you can be friends with, it determines who you can get married to. And we have a similar relationship with status. Like I said, it just can be a little bit more covert. I think we're learning about it more as we read more about some of the challenges of social media, right? because there's this strong temptation to grade ourselves against our peers that really gets highlighted on things like social media. And there's these huge number of studies about how self-esteem issues and anxiety issues are arising because of social media. But it also has to do with our careers. It could be that maybe you didn't consider certain career options, maybe ones that would be really actually a good fit, but the status associated with it wasn't quite what you wanted. Or maybe you turned down other opportunities in life because they didn't appear to have the prestige that you felt suited you, even though the opportunity was suiting. Now, the weird thing about this is it's not actually to say that achieving is wrong, or there's something wrong with that. You can actually find yourself ascending this social ladder by achieving. That happens. And it would be really weird if the takeaway here was, stop being so darn good at stuff. It's not the solution. It's a misidentification of a problem, because we look at John and he actually achieved a lot. He was given a very clear mission by God, and he did that thing. He was preparing the way for the Messiah. And similarly, there are things that Jesus has called each of us to, and there's times when we do those things very well for the goodness of his glory, that a higher status and prestige will come along, just like for John. And then also just like for John, there's times when it will all come crashing down when we're following Jesus. So achieving isn't actually what is at issue here. But in Luke 14, Jesus is asking us, what is your relationship to status? What is your relationship to platform? What's your relationship to your title and to the desire you have for prestige? And it's likely that some of us need to have an honest conversation with Jesus and hear his voice that is inviting us to that lower seat. I needed to hear that conversation or that invitation in the conversations I was having at that conference I was at, to stop posturing so much, to be invited to go lower. And in my life now, I need to hear it in my family, because sometimes, it's hardest to give up what we feel like we most deserve when we're with the people we most love, in a weird way, the people that we're closest with. I need to hear that invitation with my family. And maybe you need to hear it as you consider serving here at Anchor, because there's some serving opportunities that are just always open here at Anchor. There's people who do continue to faithfully serve in those unwanted spots, and they're intentionally choosing the lower seat. It's actually literally tiny chairs, and sometimes even sitting on the floor over in our Anchor Kids wing. And I wonder if God is inviting some of us here in this room to let go of some of what we feel like we deserve and also choose this lower seat of loving kids well. Jesus calls kids the least of these. I wonder if God is calling some of us to go serve those least of these. So the invitation, it could be many things. It could be serving for your coworkers in different ways, or serving the poor and marginalized, your family. Some of you, though, are hearing this list of things, and you're kind of wondering about this invitation, and you might be getting a little bit overwhelmed. And you're getting overwhelmed because you've gone down this path before. You've tried some of this stuff, and you've tried this way of following Jesus, this life of forsaking yourself, serving others, serving the church, serving sacrificially, and you actually burned yourself out on it. I mean, I've been there. I've had that response. And I think we're familiar with that because we're actually missing a piece of this step. Because here's the temptation. I don't know if everybody's college experience was like this, but I'm like an older millennial, and when I was in college as a Christian, there was just a lot of Christian activism at the time. It was beautiful, it was challenging, it was awakening for me. I was learning about global poverty, I was learning about people suffering about preventable diseases, I was learning about sex trafficking, I was learning about environmentalism, all these things. And like Christians, sometimes we can be kind of funny about things. Like there was these, when I was in college, initiatives to do things like not buy your daily latte and then save the money that you would have spent in the latte so then you could donate it so that there'd be clean water for people in need, which is really good, really good. But then we could be funny about it because you'd do that and then you'd get a t-shirt that would show what you've done, inviting other people to do it. but it just felt performative, right? It just felt like performative activism, and that's some of what my college years was like. Plus, it was exhausting to have to feel like you had to keep up on all of those things, whether it be environmentalism, whether it be learning about or caring about things that were, across the world, poverty and other places. I felt an intense pressure to care about it, and like a lot of my peers, I got kind of burnt out on it. And I believe that's because in this way of discipleship, on this pathway to humility, it doesn't actually work without the deeper life. And it's the next thing we're going to talk about. So what do I mean by the deeper life? And how does it lead to humility? Okay, so I just mentioned in college I started to feel fatigue around Christian activism. I was also feeling in college a fair bit of fatigue around devotional practices like Bible reading and prayer. So what was happening to me in those years? Well, this was angst. We talked about angst last week. It's what propels us forward on the pathway. I was feeling dissatisfied. I was feeling tired. I was feeling burnt out. And it's because the practice of my faith lacked depth. And I say that I was fatigued, but there was also in me like a deeper longing that I was pretty aware of as well. There was something in me that wanted something greater, something more. And I think it's something we all have in us. And we just have to get in touch with that deeper longing to propel us forward on this path out of angst, and it opens up into what I'm calling the deeper life. Now, the deeper life entails a lot, and we're going to hone in on a couple things. We're going to look at John the Baptist because he was practicing some of the disciplines that I think are essential to the deeper life, and it's silence and solitude. So, why did John live in the wilderness? Why did he live out in the desert? Well, at that time, living in the wilderness was primarily a way to seek life from a life of spiritual purity, to seek closeness to God, away from distractions, away from temptations of society. So you moved out to the wilderness. It was a spiritual practice. And plus, it's just a place where there's not a lot of things like water, food, shelter, friends, and it's a place you go to rely on God. The same thing is offered to us in this practice of silence and solitude. Dallas Willard says that by practicing silence and solitude, you will see the world, it's not on your shoulders after all. The world is not on your shoulders after all in this practice. So our great pride is we kind of believe that the world is on our shoulders, at least our own world is, and the temptation then is for us to live a life of ascent, to climb the next mountain of our career, our education, or of parenting, or whatever it is, and that the whole world, or our own world at least, depends on us. But the practice of silence and solitude, it invites us on a different path. It invites us to decrease, to descend past our pride of ourselves and into the will of God. We tend to crave noise and activity, busy lives, because it distracts us. It distracts us from the emptiness we feel inside, making us feel that we somehow matter. But in silence and solitude, there's spaces where we're confronted with that emptiness, and then we let God fill it. And then in stillness, we become aware of our own brokenness. We become aware of our own need for grace, and it's there that we find the radical love and the presence of God. In silence, we come face to face with the good and the bad and the ugly of our souls, and it's from there that we invite Jesus to meet us in the quiet and to make us whole. It's this counterintuitive thing. It's the backwards kingdom of Jesus. But if we look deep enough in us, we find that we long for that. We long for this path. And it starts from there, from a longing, and then it goes into this practice. And I'm going to describe what it looks like because I think it'll be helpful. Because I think silence and solitude, that sounds kind of mysterious, and it's actually really simple and really practical. It's kind of silly how easy it is. So first thing that you do is you pick a consistent time. For you, it could be just the final moments right before you rush off to your morning commute. It could be the sudden silence that happens in your car right after you drop off your kids at school. Could be an office break or a lunch break at the office. It could be the first thing you do in the day or the last thing you do before you go to bed. The when, it doesn't really matter as long as the when is consistent, because there's no such thing as a habit that doesn't happen consistently. So just a consistent time. You pick that time, and then you create a ritual around it, which sounds fancy, but it's just allowing an ordinary thing to become sacred. So this could just be a favorite chair at your house, or the back the back porch. It could be a window seat on the city bus. And then for some people, posture is important. Sometimes people will just sit up straight with their 2 feet planted on the floor in front of them, hands out in their lap, palms up, and then just take deep breaths from that place, breathing in slowly, breathing out slowly, and then praying something simple and invitational, just like, Lord, here I am. Or come, Holy Spirit. Lord, have mercy. And then after that, it's just being quiet. It's waiting. It's being still. And when I do it, I have to set a timer because I always want to check the clock and see how much time has gone by. So I set a timer to let me know how long, and it frees up some brain space. You can start with something small, like 2 minutes, and then just do that every day. And after you do 2 minutes of silence, after a month or so, bump it up to 4, maybe bump it up to 6 after a while, and you keep going, maybe get to 10 minutes. And then this is important. As you practice, resist the urge to decide if the practice of silent prayer and solitude, if it's working. I really encourage you, don't evaluate if you're getting anything out of it. Because you likely will feel like you're not, and you're likely going to feel like, my mind is insane. It's going crazy. But then you get these glimmers where you see God working with time and patience. And this is how God works. You're going to feel like you're not getting anything out of it, but it's not actually about your work. It is God's work. Prayer is God's work. And so it's not about if you feel like you're failing, because God always succeeds. He will be faithful at the time you give him. So simply trust the practice of a couple centuries worth of saints and the practice of Jesus himself. It's probably a good thing to have in your life too. And then just keep practicing it. And then one day you're going to look up and you're going to discover that somewhere along the way, the practice of silence and solitude became a lifeline for you. It became essential for you. And then there's going to be times where you're like, man, I don't know if this is worth it. And you're going to look ahead and, man, I'm thousands of miles from where I want to be. But then at the same time, you can realize you're 1,000 miles from where you came from. This is how the deeper life works. So we've looked at these two paths. And if we're going to decrease, we start off with our discipleship to Jesus, taking that seriously and becoming people who go to the lowest seat at the table. We think of ourselves less, we serve other people more. That's our discipleship to Jesus. And then second, we foster humility in our lives by practicing the deeper life, practicing silence and solitude, incorporating those in our lives. But then there's a third way, there's a third part of this, and it's different than these other two because it's not often a path that we choose. And it's the path of decreasing by way of difficulty. So in my mid-20s, I was just getting started in church ministry, and it didn't take me long to notice that other pastors who were ahead of me by a couple decades, they were the pastors that seemed to have this kind of this thing. And this it wasn't charisma, it wasn't a certain skill set, it wasn't what get called resume virtues. But what I found as I heard their stories was that these particular leaders had these tremendous histories of tremendous difficulty in their life, real heartbreaking things. Past failure, church hurt, seasons of burnout, of mental breakdown. You can think of a pastor who had experienced the death of a spouse. And I remember wondering as a young leader, like, why do all the leaders I admire have such broken pasts? Like, I started wondering, like, is this what it takes? And it was a reckoning moment for me. And now, I'm later in life, I realize, like, this is odd to say, but I'm realizing, of course that's true. Because difficulty, hardship, and pain is the ground for spiritual growth and formation where Jesus works. It's not the only way, but it's very fertile ground for spiritual growth in Jesus. And it's no secret, these seasons of difficulty, they lead us to rely more deeply on God's grace, more deeply on his strength, and that builds humility in us, that builds dependence on Jesus. And of course, difficulty, this is kind of a step backwards in this pathway. You might be going, we were just talking about angst last week, so you think we'd be done with it. However, I think a more accurate depiction of the pathway, it'd be something like this. You'd go like interested, engaging, angst, humility, angst, humility, angst, humility, angst, humility. Because in the Christian life, if you've done this for very long, of course you've realized we have many seasons of angst. I've started to picture it like a rock tumbler, an angst humility rock tumbler. And if you know how this rock tumbler works, you put in the rock, it's rough, it has all its coarseness, it has all its edges, and you put it in the barrel and it spins for a long time. It has all this grit and water in it. It takes a lot longer than you think. My kids got one of these, and we polished up some rocks. And over time, what happens is the coarse edges of the rocks are smoothed out, and it becomes something different, quite beautiful. And I have a rock that went through a rock tumbler right here. And you can see, even from where you are in the room, hopefully, you can see how smooth it is, and you can see how beautiful it is. You can see how it shines. And hopefully you can also then see some of or just know the story of this rock, that once it didn't look like this. It didn't feel like this. There was rough, coarse edges to it. But over time, it participated in a process in which it was smoothed out. Its edges were worn off. It became more beautiful. This is like our lives. We have rough edges, but God has started a work in us. And it is a long work. But God is a God, He's not in a hurry. He wants to create something lasting and beautiful in each of our lives, and He will continue His work. So again, how do we get this kind of beauty in our lives? We looked at John, and he was a great example for a bit, but a truer guide, a truer example is the one that John says, who must increase while we decrease. This is Jesus. We're going to take a look, closing out this teaching time, and go by looking at Philippians 2. This is where Paul shares one of the earliest Christian hymns. It's sometimes called the Christ hymn. And it's this powerful passage that emphasizes Jesus' incredible humility, and it's reminding us that even though Jesus is divine, He is the God of the universe, but He doesn't cling to that status. He doesn't use it to His own advantage, it says. Instead, He takes on ultimate humility by becoming human. He becomes like us, and He obediently follows in the way of humanity, accepting death. It's death on a cross, the shameful, painful death. And Jesus is the one that we follow. Jesus is our model. Jesus is the one who shows us what true humility is, what true decreasing is. It's the God of the universe becoming human and taking on death, our death. And we're invited to be like Jesus, not seeking status, not seeking recognition, but willingly embracing humility as we want to be people who are serving others and who are knowingly following Jesus on this pathway that includes suffering. And that's easy enough to say, like serving others, following Jesus on a pathway of suffering. But how do we actually do that? You think about it, like I've tried that. That's not the easiest thing. And when we might be just forgetting our secret weapon with questions like that, because when we ask, what is actual decreasing? How do I actually do that? How do I actually think of others as better than myself? And for us, our secret weapon in this is the deep sense of security that we have in God's love, which frees us from constantly thinking about ourselves. God's love, it frees us from being consumed on our own agenda. When we grasp how Jesus laid aside His glory for our sake, it reshapes our motivation, it reshapes our hearts for others, it enables us to serve without worrying about what our status is and what we have to gain, and if we're going to be recognized. Truly knowing the love of Jesus, it remakes us and empowers us. And we're going to take a moment to reflect on the humility of Jesus now. I'm going to read that passage from Philippians 2, and then I'm just going to pause. I'm going to allow the quiet of the moment, allow us to reflect on who Jesus is. The band is going to keep playing, and as they do, I just want you to allow Jesus' humility to astonish you. So I'll read this, and then I'll come back up. We'll take a moment of quiet, and then I'll come up to close us out. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Let's remember Jesus now. What we read from John 3 and then Philippians 2, they both end with the same truth, that Jesus, in the end of these passages, he's exalted. John says, Jesus, you increase. In Philippians, it says he's exalted. And this is what's true of God's kingdom. Humility leads to honor. And it's because Jesus was willing to descend so low, God raised him to this highest place of authority and glory. And what's so wild is that same promise is available to us. We read about it in that passage in Luke 14. It says, take the lowest place so that when your host comes, he will say, friend, move to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So sometimes we have it in us to take the lowest seat. And then sometimes the lowest seat comes and finds us in life. But it's from that seat that we can trust that one day we will hear the words, friend, move up. And we will know this mystery that God can exalt us as he exalted Christ after his suffering. So I'm going to invite the prayer team, I'm going to invite the communion team forward, and we're going to close out our time exalting Jesus. At Anchor, the communion table, it's open to anyone who's said yes to Jesus. If you'd like to say yes to Jesus for the first time, come and take communion today. Someone's going to hand you bread that symbolizes Jesus' body, that it's going to have been dipped in juice that symbolizes his blood, and you take it and you eat it. And if it's your first time, just let us know about it. Fill out one of those cards, put it in the box in the back, visit a prayer station, tell me or another pastor, let us know. And then as we take communion together, let's remember how Jesus, he emptied himself. He took on the very form of a servant, humbling himself even to the point of death on a cross for our sake. That's what we remember when we take the bread and the cup today. Just as Jesus humbled himself in obedience, we're invited to humbly receive his grace with worship and thanks. So God, we look to you as our example. Would you lead us in your radical way of humility? Would you lead and shepherd our hearts even now? You guys can head to the communion table as you're ready.